Welcome to Detective Reddington's office. Take a seat and listen to this story. It will be interesting. It all started with a seemingly ordinary day, one of those days that you don't expect to hold any surprises. My wife, Karen, and I had been married for over 15 years. We'd shared a lifetime of memories, raising our kids, building a home together, going through the ups and downs that every couple faces. I thought we were solid, sure, maybe the spark had dimmed over the years, but I believed we were in it for the long haul. We were partners, friends, and had weathered life storms together. Looking back now, I can't help but see all the little signs I missed. There was a time when she'd always share her day with me, tell me about the things that were on her mind, no matter how small. But over the past few months, she'd become distant, often lost in her thoughts. She'd started spending more time on her phone, always quick to hide the screen or change the subject if I asked about her plans for the day. She'd say it was just work or chatting with friends, and I didn't press her. I trusted her. After all, 15 years of marriage builds a kind of faith that you don't question easily. One evening, as I came home from work, I found Karen sitting on the couch, her face illuminated by her phone's glow, her expression one of intense focus. I asked how her day was, and she looked up, startled, as though I'd interrupted something important. She gave me a distracted smile and muttered, "Oh, it was fine," before returning to her screen. I brushed it off, thinking maybe she was stressed or just needed a little space. But as the days went by, her behavior grew more peculiar. She'd started going out more often, mentioning new friends I'd never met, telling me she was meeting up with them for a drink or a quick dinner. There was a new perfume too, one I'd never seen before, a subtle but unmistakable fragrance that lingered long after she'd left the room. At first, I convinced myself it was harmless. People change, hobbies change, and maybe she was just finding new interests. But a small, nagging feeling grew in the back of my mind, one I couldn't shake, no matter how hard I tried. One evening, as I went to put away the laundry, I noticed something strange. Karen's clothes smelled different. Not just the new perfume, but a mix of scents that didn't feel like home. It was subtle, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, didn't want to let my mind wander to places that could tear us apart. But the doubt had already planted itself, and I couldn't pretend anymore. Over the next week, I found myself watching her more closely, noticing every little detail that had once gone unnoticed. I started paying attention to her habits, the times she'd step out of the room to take calls, the way her phone was always locked and out of reach. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was reading too much into things. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Finally, one night, as Karen slept beside me, I decided to check her phone. I felt a pang of guilt even as I reached for it, but my need for the truth was stronger. Her phone was locked, of course, but as I sat there in the darkness, I knew that this was only the beginning. The next morning, I couldn't shake the guilt of what I'd done. Snooping through her things went against every principle I believed in. But something deep inside told me that my instincts were right. I tried to act normal, going through the motions of our morning routine. Karen was cheerful, chatting about her plans for the day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all a facade. It felt like I was watching a stranger, someone playing the role of the woman I'd loved for so many years. That day at work, I found it hard to concentrate. The thoughts kept circling in my mind, the nagging questions growing louder with every passing hour. Finally, I made a decision. I'd contact an old friend of mine, Mike, who had once worked as a private investigator. He was someone I could trust, someone discreet who would understand the delicacy of the situation. When I called Mike, I kept the details brief. "I don't have proof," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "But I have this feeling, Mike, one I can't ignore." He listened carefully, not judging, not interrupting, just letting me get it all out. "I'll look into it, buddy," he said. "If there's anything to find, I'll let you know. But are you sure you want to go down this road?" I hesitated, but then nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "I have to know, Mike, whatever it takes." By the end of that week, I had my answer, though it was one I hadn't wanted to hear. Mike had found something. A series of texts, photos, and locations that left no doubt in my mind. Karen had been meeting someone else, someone who wasn't just a friend. My hands shook as I went through the evidence he'd sent me, the reality of her betrayal sinking in with every new message. That night, I sat alone in the dark, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on me like a heavy stone. The evidence was undeniable. Every text, every photo, every hidden moment she'd shared with this other man. Each one felt like a blade, cutting deeper into the life I thought we'd built together. I kept replaying the moments in my mind, trying to pinpoint when things had gone wrong. Had I missed the signs? Had I been too absorbed in my work, too complacent in our marriage to notice the growing distance between us? The next morning, I made the choice to confront her, but I wanted to do it calmly, without letting the anger consume me. I didn't want to shout or fight. I just wanted the truth, to hear it from her own lips. I waited until she got home that evening, and as soon as she walked through the door, I could tell something in my expression had given me away. She paused, her eyes flickering with a brief flash of fear, before quickly masking it with a smile. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice steady, but I could see the tension in her posture. I took a deep breath and motioned for her to sit down. "Karen, we need to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Her eyes darted to the side, a hint of guilt flashing across her face before she composed herself. She sat down slowly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, waiting. As she sat across from me, the silence stretched, heavy and loaded. I placed the folder with the evidence on the table between us, watching as her eyes flickered to it, her face pale. She didn't reach for it. Instead, she looked away, unable to meet my gaze, her hands shaking slightly. "Karen," I said quietly, my voice strained, "I know about him. I know everything." For a moment, she didn't respond, her shoulders slumping under the weight of the truth. Finally, she took a deep breath and looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "I didn't mean for you to find out like this," she whispered. "Didn't mean for me to find out?" I repeated, the words feeling bitter on my tongue. "Did you mean for this to happen at all? Did you mean to betray everything we had, everything we built together?" She looked down, tears streaming down her face as she struggled to find the words. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't even know how it started. I felt lost, and he was there, and I held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. I didn't want to hear the excuses, the justifications. Nothing she could say would undo the betrayal or ease the pain it had caused. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at her as a mix of anger, sadness, and disappointment coursed through me. The woman sitting across from me didn't seem like the same person I'd married all those years ago. I could barely recognize her through the veil of lies and betrayal. She was still avoiding my gaze, her shoulders slumped, her hands twisting nervously. I could see she was afraid, maybe even remorseful, but at that moment, it was hard to feel any sympathy. "What did he give you that I couldn't?" I finally asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. "What did you find with him that you didn't have with me?" She flinched as if my words had struck her physically. "Paul," she whispered, her voice raw with guilt. "It wasn't about you. It wasn't that you weren't enough. I was just feeling empty, like something was missing in my life, and he filled that void." "Filled a void," I echoed, the words sounding hollow and foreign. "So instead of talking to me, instead of working on our marriage, you turned to someone else?" Her silence answered for her, and it was all I needed to know. I stood up, pacing the room as I tried to make sense of the chaos her words had created. Every promise we'd made, every shared moment and future plan, now felt like ashes, scattered by her careless choices. In the quiet moments that followed, a strange calm settled over me. I realized then that I needed more than just an apology. I needed closure, a final chapter to this story she had rewritten without me. And so, I asked her for details, not because I wanted to understand him, but because I needed to understand the extent of her betrayal. Karen hesitated, visibly struggling with the weight of my question. She looked down, twisting her wedding ring around her finger, her expression a mixture of shame and regret. "It started innocently enough," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "We were just talking. He was someone I met through a friend, and he seemed interested in my life, my thoughts. I know that sounds shallow, but I hadn't felt that way in a long time." I clenched my fists, trying to contain the emotions rising within me. Her words felt like daggers, each one deepening the wound she'd already inflicted. "And how long did it take for these innocent conversations to turn into something more?" I asked, my voice steady but cold. She swallowed, her gaze still fixed on the floor. "A few months. It was gradual, like a line I didn't realize I was crossing until I was too far gone." Her voice cracked, and I could see the tears welling up in her eyes again. "I never wanted it to hurt you, Paul. I know that sounds impossible to believe, but it's the truth. I was lost, and he made me feel seen." "Seen," I repeated bitterly. "I saw you every day. I loved you every day. I thought that was enough." My words hung in the air, the bitterness thickening between us. For a brief moment, I almost felt a pang of regret for putting her through this interrogation. But then I remembered the images, the texts, each one a piece of the betrayal she had chosen over our marriage. But even as she sat there, breaking down in front of me, I knew this conversation wasn't enough. I needed more than answers. I needed a way to move forward, to find my footing after the ground had been ripped out from under me. And with that thought, an idea started to form, one that would give me the closure I needed, even if it meant sharing the truth with others who deserved to know. The next few days passed in a blur. Karen had moved out temporarily, staying with a friend while we figured out our next steps. I barely slept, my mind racing with a mixture of anger, grief, and a strange kind of relief that I no longer had to pretend everything was fine. I began piecing together the evidence, each message and photo, every detail of her betrayal, as if assembling a puzzle that would finally reveal the whole picture of what had happened to our marriage. But there was one last step, one final truth that needed to come to light. Her parents had been a huge part of our lives, almost like a second family to me. They'd been there through the milestones of our marriage, celebrated holidays and birthdays with us, supported us during hard times. I couldn't bear the thought of them believing that our marriage had fallen apart without understanding why. I felt they deserved to know the truth, painful as it was. I wrestled with the decision, feeling a strange mixture of guilt and resolve. Part of me wondered if this was too harsh, if it was simply an act of vengeance. But deep down, I knew it wasn't about revenge. It was about closure, about freeing myself from the weight of secrets and lies. If Karen had made the choice to betray our life together, then she had to face the consequences of that choice. So, one evening, I sat down, opened my laptop, and began compiling everything into a single folder. The messages, the photos, the timestamps. They were all there, each piece of evidence a testament to the truth she had tried to hide. When I was done, I attached the folder to an email, addressing it to her parents. My hands shook as I typed the message, explaining as calmly as I could that they deserved to know the real reason for the end of our marriage. With a final deep breath, I hit send, watching as the email disappeared into my outbox. There was no going back now. I felt a strange sense of calm, as if I'd finally taken control of a situation that had once felt so overwhelming. This was my way of letting go, of releasing the anger and betrayal, and beginning the slow process of healing. After I sent the email, a heavy silence settled over me. For a moment, I questioned my decision. Her parents had always treated me like family, and I knew this news would devastate them. But the more I thought about it, the more I knew that honesty was the only path forward. I'd spent months in the dark, oblivious to the secrets that had been unraveling my marriage behind closed doors. Now, for better or worse, the truth was out in the open. The next morning, I got a call from her mother. I could hear the heartbreak in her voice, the disbelief as she tried to understand how the daughter she loved could have betrayed the life we'd all built together. "Paul," she said softly, her voice shaking, "we had no idea. We thought you two were happy." "So did I," I replied, my voice tight, trying to hold back the flood of emotions. But it seems that somewhere along the way that changed for her. I'm sorry you had to find out this way, but I thought you deserved to know. She was quiet for a long moment before whispering, "Thank you for telling us. I know it couldn't have been easy." I could feel her pain through the phone, and for the first time since all of this had begun, I realized I wasn't alone in my grief. They, too, were mourning a relationship they thought would last forever, a future they'd imagined for their daughter and me. Over the next few days, I spoke to her family more than I had in years. They called to check on me, offering their support and expressing their own feelings of betrayal. It was strange, finding solace in the very people who should have felt obligated to stand by her. But instead, they chose to stand by the truth, by the life we had shared. And in a way that helped me begin to heal, to feel less isolated in the pain. Karen, meanwhile, stayed distant. She sent a few messages, apologizing, asking if we could talk, but I ignored them. I wasn't ready to hear her apologies, to listen to explanations that felt hollow after everything she'd done. I needed time, space to rebuild my life on my own terms, without her shadow looming over every decision. The weeks that followed were filled with an emptiness I could never have anticipated. The home that Karen and I had built together felt hollow, each room echoing with memories of what we once had. I'd catch myself looking at the empty spaces, wondering how we'd gone from laughter-filled dinners to the silence that now greeted me. It was a pain that clung to every corner, a reminder that the life I thought was real had been a facade. But as days passed, that silence started to feel different. Less oppressive, more freeing, like a blank slate that I could rebuild, piece by piece. I threw myself into work, into hobbies I'd set aside for years. I started running in the mornings, finding solace in the steady rhythm of my footsteps, the crisp morning air filling my lungs. Each step felt like a release, like I was shedding layers of the life I'd left behind. Slowly, I started to find myself again, the person I'd been before I'd built my world around someone else. Friends, family, even Karen's parents reached out, offering support, inviting me to dinners and gatherings. Their kindness was a lifeline, a reminder that, despite the betrayal, I wasn't alone. I reconnected with old friends, sharing stories and laughter that I hadn't experienced in years. They reminded me of the person I was, the strength I had lost sight of in the haze of betrayal. One evening, as I sat in the quiet of my living room, I felt a sense of peace settling over me. It wasn't the kind of peace that comes from forgetting. It was the peace that comes from acceptance, from knowing that I had faced the worst and come out stronger. I realized that I was finally ready to let go, to release the anger, the resentment, and make room for something new. Months turned into a year, and in that time, I rebuilt a life that was truly mine. The pain had faded, replaced by a resilience I hadn't known I possessed. I no longer avoided places that held memories of Karen. Instead, I embraced them, allowing myself to remember the good moments without letting them define my present. I was free in a way I hadn't felt in years. One day, I ran into an old friend, Sarah, at a local coffee shop. We hadn't seen each other in years, but as we caught up, I felt a spark of familiarity, a warmth I hadn't expected. We talked about everything: life, work, even the painful end of my marriage. She listened without judgment, her presence a comfort I hadn't realized I needed. We started meeting regularly, our friendship blossoming into something deeper, something grounded in mutual respect and understanding. With Sarah, there was no pressure, no need to pretend. She accepted me, scars and all, and in her company, I found a renewed sense of purpose. She showed me that life could be rich and fulfilling, that love could come from a place of strength rather than dependence. Together, we created new memories, laughter echoing through the walls of my home, replacing the silence that had once felt so heavy. Looking back now, I realized that Karen's betrayal, as painful as it had been, had ultimately led me to a life I never could have imagined. It had forced me to confront myself, to rebuild my foundation on my own terms. I was no longer defined by the past, no longer haunted by memories of what once was. Instead, I was filled with hope for what lay ahead, ready to embrace the future with open arms and an open heart. As Sarah and I stood on the balcony, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I reached for her hand, feeling a quiet, unspoken understanding pass between us. The pain, the heartache, the betrayal. All of it had been a chapter, but it was not the end. This, I realized, was my new beginning.